recording. Okay, Rob.
Okay. This technique that I'm going to talk about came about by accident. One day, many years ago, I was painting a model with some olive drab, and it was late. I got home from school real late, and I was tired. The phone rang. It startled me, and I knocked over a bottle of paint onto my plastic cover surface here. So what I wound up doing is that at the time I had a regular household cleaning sponge that I keep for wiping down my surfaces after I get done to get all the dust out and whatnot. And I used that to pick up all the spilled paint and to wring it back into the bottle. Okay? And I dabbed it. Hey, I was 13 years old. Give me a break.
Yeah.
And I was wringing back the paint back into the bottle as much as I could. Then I realized you can squeeze and squeeze like getting blood out of a turnip. And only so much paint came out. So what was left on the brush, I said, well, the hell with it. I might as well just go ahead and dapple it all over the model since it was just a solid color green. So basically, I did that, and then I let it sit overnight, and I came back, because I was tired, as I said. I came back the next day, and amazingly enough, this is what I saw. An absolutely flat, brushless, brushstrokeless surface that looked like something that was applied with an airbrush. And then I said to myself, that's a pretty cool idea. Now, even though I had an airbrush and I love using the airbrush, I decided, well, let me try something else, something new, something different. So over the span of about 30 years, I came up with this idea to where I can do just about any camouflage pattern on an airplane or even metal surfaces or dope surfaces, as I will show here in a minute, using this technique. Now, the trick basically is one of two ways you can do this. On models that have a lot of detail, like raised panel lines, like these old kits, I like to paint the base light color and paint the whole airplane first, let it sit for 2 days, and then I come back with the darker color. Now here I will demonstrate how you can do that, and for the newer kits that have shallower detail and recessed panel lines, you can paint one color in one area and then paint the other color in the other area, or the third color if there are 3 colors, so that you don't put too much paint on the surface and obliterate your detail. So the first technique that I'll use will be here. Now if you noticed, I sketched out the camouflage pattern on this airplane using a number 2 pencil. Can everybody see that? Mm-hmm. Okay. So then basically what I do is I just go right up to the hardline surface and paint the actual surface area that I want to paint. Now when you're using this technique where you're putting a dark color over a lighter color, even if you use enamels or acrylic paint, you should let the base color dry for a good 2 days before you apply the second color. Now, here's the secret right here, a piece of foam rubber. And there are 4 different kinds that I brought along to give you an idea. And all you do, and you notice how the paint is all built up and you see blush streaks and everything there? Now watch this. Just by dappling the paint all along the edge here and softening the edge line, you can blend the paint out and you take the excess paint out. Now this particular subject had a harder line with a very light spray edge on the end of it. Okay. Okay.
Very nice.
Now we'll go over here. Your paint should be fairly thin. It doesn't have to be extremely thin. I prefer it to be a medium consistency.
And you're using an enamel right now?
I'm using enamel. Can't you smell it?
Yeah. So what do you do? Thin it in the bottle?
I thin it in the bottle, yes.
Okay.
I use an eyedropper or a paint eyedropper.
So you're using a Model Master, right?
Model Master OD Green.
Okay, so approximately what's the paint to thinner ratio?
Well, I'll show you that here in a minute because it depends on the shade, it depends on the color.
Okay.
On my Russian aircraft there, the lighter blue had to be very thin because if it came out too thick, it would start to fade through the other gray that I put up on top.
So 70 thinner, 30 paint, something like that?
It isn't, no, it depends on the color. Every time you open up your bottle, you see this consistency right here? Okay, this kind of consistency?
Okay.
That's what you want.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
Okay?
That's about like milk.
It's just like 1%. Now, I'm going pretty quickly through this because I'm using different kinds of foams and stuff. Now, the real neat thing about using foam is that with a nice pair of scissors, if you want to make a smaller pattern, like the German the German Night Fighter pattern and stuff, you can cut this down, shape it any way you want, and you can have much better control. Now, the trick you have to remember is that you've got to apply this paint, this technique in a reasonably quick time because enamel paints have a tendency to dry very quickly. Okay, and when you want to do areas, whole areas or large areas, you don't want to put a lot of paint on a whole wing. You want to do like a 2 by 2 inch square area, dapple it with the sponge, and then go on, constantly overlapping the layers as you go across. Is that clear to everybody?
Yeah, so the question I have is like on this big pattern here.
Right.
You do like a quarter of it at a time?
In fact, yep, I can do that right now. Okay, and I just put my hand and I put a, nope, it was dry good. Huh?
It's water base will come right off.
Right. Now, the underside of this airplane has not been painted, so I'm not worried about going over my margin.
Right.
And the beauty about this technique is if you go past your line, or if for some reason your paint on your base coat was not dry enough and you start to see that milky effect come through, you can always stop, wait for the paint to dry, go back with some 300 or 400 grit, sand it down very lightly, and it'll take the top color right off. Now, as you can see how I'm pushing the paint towards the area that's not painted. Okay? And I'm feathered, that's the word I was trying to remember. You feather the paint towards the area that you're going to continue painting. Does everybody see that?
Yeah.
Okay?
So Rob, where are you getting your foam from?
Well, that's a good question. From appliances, it's packing foam. From appliances that you buy, when you buy a toaster or a microwave, there will be packing foam inside the box. Take it. That's what this stuff is. It's packing foam.
So,
Now-
so is it soft like pillow foam or is it hard like?
Pass it around.
Yeah, okay.
So you guys can, in fact, you guys can take a sample and take it home and try it out if you like. I got plenty.
Well, I was just wondering if you use like, they have those cosmetic foams that the women use for putting on foundation and
Well,
stuff.
those are fine. The problem is, why buy the stuff when you can get it for free?
I'm married, so I can get it for free.
Then basically you have just stated that you can supply foam for everybody here. Or I can supply it because I have got tons and tons and tons of this stuff. Now you see, I'm not really worried about making mistakes like this, over feathering and things like that, because once the paint is done and dry, again after a couple of days, I will go back and sand this area down, or even scrape it with a blunt blade and take all those imperfections away. Now I'm deliberately allowing one section here to dry so that you will see the mistake that can happen if you don't use the feathering of moving the paint towards the area. You see how that line there is drying and this line here is not? That's going to cause a shadow. Okay? Now, it's already too late to fix it while the paint is wet. You're going to have to let that dry, and then you're going to have to go back with some 200 or 300 grit and feather it. And these mistakes you will do until you develop your own system and your own technique on doing your painting. And I can see that this paint needs to be a little bit thinner. I think I should thin it a little bit more.
Everybody got some foam?
Anybody have any other questions so far?
So it doesn't work well with acrylics?
No, it works just fine with acrylics.
Oh, okay.
Yep, it works just fine with acrylics. Now, acrylic paints like the paste paints that come in tubes like the Helio and some of these other brands, where you have to thin it out, you got to be really careful on how you thin out the paint so that you don't get too much of a wash effect. And then you'll wind up removing, if you're doing a base coat and then a top coat on top of it, you'll wind up damaging your paint surface if you have it too thin. With acrylic, there's a less risk of that. With enamels, there's a larger risk because it tends to get into the plastic, into the pigment, and it can damage the detail.
How does the foam hold up if you're using a lacquer?
Well, when you're using lacquer, you've got to test your foam to see if the foam will be eaten or dissolved. And it will happen, yeah. If that happens, then you got the wrong piece of foam. You would have to use a more plastic-based foam for that. Also, if you're going to use gloss paints, like you're doing a body of a car, and you want that orange peel look to make it look like a real American-made car out of the factory, you can use this technique with gloss paint, but your paint has to be very, very thin, almost airbrush thin. Because if it's not, you'll start separating the pigment from the gloss, and you'll get like hair. You ever see that when you
Yep.
dapple it and it just starts to get wavy and fuzzy? Yeah, so you got to be careful. So this is already dry here, and you can see there are no streaks or anything in it. Okay, now I'm going to stop here for a moment because I want to try another technique. And before I do, we brought up that subject. When you're doing whole sections, for example, camouflage, you can get a lot more paint on here. You can really apply the paint thick if you like. Okay, and you see how that is there. In cases like this, when it's a bigger area, I like using a larger area of a piece of foam. Now, I have multiple foams here. Usually, I just use one piece of foam. As the foam gets heavy with paint, you just use a scissor and cut that area away, and you just press on with pride. You see that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Looks just like a spray painted surface.
Yeah.
The nice thing about it is that I really like about it is that if a judge really wants to look real close at this technique, he's going to see orange peel. And that's exactly what he should see on a real airplane. Because these airbrushes these industrial airbrushes they use to paint these airplanes in the factory were not the kind that you use in detailed techniques and things like that. It was a very large, actually it was a half-inch wide spray, which fans out to about 4 inches wide, and it left a lot of overspray and or orange peel on the subject. And if you don't like it, again, after you give it a couple of days to dry with enamel paint, you give it a couple of days to dry, you can go back with some 5, 6, or even 800 grit and just feather it lightly. I use a little water, and then I can blend all of that orange peel out, just like you do on the car body, when you want to take orange peel out of car body paint. Okay. Hey, now somebody brought up the subject yesterday about keeping your paints clean and your jars and everything clean. One thing I do while I'm waiting is, if you notice, I clean out the inside of my caps, and this is each and every time I use my paints. Okay, and then I do the rim of the bottle,
Yeah. Yep.
and then when you're done, this is what you want to hear. It's almost like
Yep.
glass on glass. And then all you got to do is give it a nip, and that cap will never stick.
Yep.
Okay? Here's one that I did this paint job. This was a brand new bottle of paint that I made up for this kit. I painted this about 5, 6 days ago, and I put the cap back on. See that?
Yeah.
And it'll sit like that all year round. Now, when you have to, sometimes these things separate. That's no big deal. Don't throw these inner lid liners away.
Yeah.
Because they make up the gap that's in the paint. Now, before I stir my paint, and again, you notice I don't shake my paint, I stir my paint. And some of you might think, well, that takes too long and blah, blah, blah. Well, that's entirely up to you. But I sit in front of a TV set or I listen to music, I use the back of a brush, and I just stir my paints. And I just keep stirring my paints until I know they're ready for use.
In other words, stirred, not shaken.
Exactly. And I'll try to get this done as fast as possible here. I want to get on to the rest of it. I don't want to use up too much time. We still have the show and tell to do. Okay, let's say this paint was ready for use. Okay, some people might think, well, hell, you got a lot of paint buildup on your brush handle there. Now, you'll know that your paint is ready, and this is both acrylic and enamel, when you can pull it out, okay, and you get a steady strip. You notice that's globby. So that means the paint isn't stirred enough yet. That's something that you won't get with shaking. I found out that when I used to shake my bottles, after I used up most of the paint, I wound up with a layer on the bottom that was pigment, which means that the paints were never stirred completely. Here, stirring the bottles is the best way to go. You guys have heard of Humbrol paints, right? The British company Humbrol's? Mm-hmm. This is the only way to work Humbrol paints. You can't shake them. Nope. You can't shake them. And the lids, the tin lids, they have to be kept clean all the time, because if they get stuck and you wind up getting them off, you'll distort them to such a point that you'll ruin the lid. Yeah, I really can't understand why Humbrol still uses those silly tin lids, but they still do. Glass jars are probably the very best. Now, let's say, for example, this paint was ready for use. I'm a cheap SOB, so I try to save every drop of paint, because this bottle is up to $4 now. I remember when these things were 79 cents.
Yeah.
Or now?
98 cents.
Or 98 cents, yeah. Now they're up to $4 a bottle. You notice I keep my arms way above the table, but I'm really bad at knocking things over. Okay.
Hobby Cannon USA does not have a lot of faster now.
Okay. Since you had some paint left over here, we can just go ahead. You see the consistency? It's a little. This is the consistency you want. Just apply it. The edges, you can use the flat. Any area of the sponge is fine, just great. Now if you do this, I did this deliberately. You see how I took up too much of the paint, okay? So there's some gray showing through. That's called a blemish. Right? No fear. Put some more paint on. No fear. Go back. Lo and behold, the blemish is gone. It's just like as if never existed. A German dapple. You mean like the mottling kind of camouflage that most people think was put on with an airbrush, but in fact was put on with a sponge or mop?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll show you. With that, let me just make sure this brush doesn't dry up on me. We can do that on this airplane because we'll just say that this P-40 was captured by the Germans and they repainted it. Okay. Let me get some grain.
Which did happen.
Yeah. To do a mottling effect, you get yourself a brush with short bristles,
So like a dapple brush?
like a dapple brush. Okay. Yep. And I'm hoping I have one here.
Still got tactical paints.
That's old school.
That's old school, so yeah. Some of those.
Pactra.
That's old Pactra, and some of those paints are still as good as the day they were made. I mean, they're just they last quite a long
Yeah.
time.
I got one that says chartreuse.
Well, there you go.
But it's no good though. It's
All right, we'll try
long
this
since
one.
it outlived its usefulness.
Okay.
So I imagine you could use your wife's foam-tipped applicators for makeup.
Mm-hmm. A lot of guys do.
I wouldn't.
Well, I mean, you know what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
Ask her permission first.
Wife's got all drab makeup on.
Yeah.
You mean something like that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. That's one technique. Another way you can do it is to, if you want to put it farther apart, use less paint. here, all you're doing with the sponge now is just removing the excess.
You're famous already.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's another technique we can use. Okay. Let's put this over here for a while. Actually, before I go any further, does anybody want to try it? Paint's here, sponges are here. Does anybody want to try the technique? Here's a panel that needs to be done all in tan. You can do that. Look how nice that came out.
Very nice.
It almost looks like one of Tony Granada's brush painted jobs.
Those are not on for
He does-
grills.
He does beautiful brush paint work.
I did all the interior work on this P40 the same way. I said this cockpit here, I'll pass that around, look at the cockpit.
Yeah.
All that was done with
What's the
sponge.
wet paint, though?
With sponge painting, and also I use a sponge painting technique when I weather aircraft as well. Okay, so, nobody wants to try it?
I'll try it.
All right, I'll get out of the way here.
Yeah.
What do you want to do? Straight blunt color, or you want to do a camouflage?
I want to do a, he wants to make a mess. I want to make a mess, yes.
Okay.
Fascinating, Kevin.
All right.
Could have saved me a lot of money if you'd done this a couple of months ago.
You know, it's kind of funny. Every time I do this demonstration, someone says those exact same words.
Yeah, I got that.
Now, you see, I don't want to take any pizzazz or anything away from airbrush painting. I still love airbrush painting. I do it very, very rarely. But as I'm getting older, the more important thing to me for building models is fun. It's not about accuracy. Well, it is about accuracy, but it's got to be fun. And this is fun. Now, it takes a lot longer than airbrushing, although I don't know, because sometimes it takes forever
To clean
to
your
do any
airbrush,
kind of
yeah.
cleaning. Yeah, that's the one biggest advantage about doing this technique. Sometimes you don't want to get the airbrush out. Sometimes you want to do a weekend build. And you can apply this technique to anything: ships, cars, aircraft, armor, figures. When you're doing uniforms, you got 12 figures to paint. You can blot paint or sponge paint the uniforms and then go back and do the detail work with the smaller brushes.
Oh, you want to use the tan?
That's all right, don't worry about it. Let him
Sorry.
These are, no, that's okay.
That's all right, don't worry
This is
about
a
it.
German, you know how many of these P40s I've got? This was one of my very favorite kits. I built.
So now he tells me it's his favorite kit.
No, no, no.
Rebel kit?
That's the old Revell 32nd scale kit that came out in 1968.
Yes.
And I like it. It's a nice kit. It's a great weekend build. The fit, considering how old it is, it's been repopped 1,000 times, and the fit is still fairly decent.
And you can still buy them relatively cheap at some
Oh,
of the
yeah.
model shows.
You can still
like
find
$10 or so.
Less than
yeah.
10 bucks, yeah. So I've got about, then whenever I do a demonstration, I'll either use this airplane or the same company, Revell, did a Spitfire, Mark
Yep,
1.
yep.
I'll use that. And if I want to do a German Splinter, I'll use their 109. Because again, I can get these kits, you know, at shows dirt cheap. How am I on time?
We're doing fine.
Okay.
So you just kind of dab it down like this?
Yeah, just like that. You don't have to be too delicate. You can press down a little bit. And you can move a little faster across your surface. When you're doing blunt paint, that's called blunt painting. When you're doing a wide area.
So do you do a streak like this, or?
What do you mean by a streak? You don't streak the paint, no, it's just
Okay.
straight up and down.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't try to streak it, because you'll just smear the paint.
Yeah.
And if you use acrylic paints, if you streak it, you'll see it. Man, it'll really separate. When you guys use acrylic paints, it will behoove you, when you use this technique, to use a primer. Use a primer on the model first, because the surface is so slick that when you use this sponge technique, you may lift too much of the paint away, and you may have to go back and paint it again. So I would advise you to use a primer, especially with lighter colors. And sometimes, with lighter colors, like the underneath blue on my Russian airplane, I had to apply twice, because it was too light, and the gray of the plastic was too dark. Okay. Any other questions?
Good job.
Okay. All right, if you want me to stop here, I can stop here. The only other thing I was gonna do, if you wanted me to, was I was gonna use a metal paint, or I should say, an aluminum, to show you how you can still use that and,
Technique on that?
on aluminum surfaces.
Yeah.
To do a metal surface.
I think we got, yeah, we got time, it's quarter.
Okay, it'll be quick, it'll be quick.
We just won't let you talk during show and tell if you run out of time.
Right. I'll go last on the show and tell. That way, if we run out of time, then I can always bring that back next month.
I think we're fine.
Let me take a look at, hey, very good. Look at this, guys. Pass it around. See that? That was your first time doing that, right?
Yeah.
That ain't no real shot.
Put it on.
I'll paint
It's great.
Playing for 20.
So when you do the interior, the zinc chroming, you were using the same technique when you do it? Wow,
Yeah.
okay.
I do the same technique.
Yeah.
I use the same technique
Earl
for all surfaces. For all surfaces. And like I said, I brought a bag of foam, so if anybody wants to take some home with them and try it out, you're more than welcome.
Yeah.
Okay, let me go here. Now this airplane, this is a Newport 17, and it was George Guinemer's Newport 17 that had metal panels up to about here, and then the rest was silver dope. Now, to distinguish between the two, and for the fact that you can see here that there's no the demarcation line is very, very
Right,
faint.
right.
Okay? Well, when I want to preserve that, I'll use tape. So where is my thing of tape? Oh, and like they say on the cooking shows, here is a metal part that I did earlier today. Let me pass that around. Okay, where's that line? Bless you. And for those that have never used Tamiya tape, I highly recommend it.
Oh, yeah.
It is the best masking tape I have ever seen in over 50 years of building models.
Tony and I echo that.
Okay, now I'm not going to use anything.
I like that new tape for curves.
Yeah.
If you guys,
Yeah.
if you haven't noticed, another thing I do is I label all the tops of my caps and I paint the tops of my caps. Makes it a lot easier when you're fishing around for colors. Okay, here's a bottle of steel that is almost used up. It's kind of old, and it hasn't been opened in over a month. And if you notice, very little effort to open the cap. Very little effort. Try to move this right along real quick.
Is that testers?
This is testers. The
Okay.
old, what used to be the old 10
Enamel
cent.
steel.
Enamels, yep.
Okay. Is that what
It's,
you
you
use
know,
to-
it's already, you already got thinner in it, right? Yeah.
Actually,
No,
it's
on
ki-
this one,
it's-
no?
You notice, look how thick
Yep.
that is. So this is where, good point, this is where I come in and use the thinner. And I have a jar of just paint thinner, not to be confused with brush cleaner. That's why I keep them in two different jars, marked differently and separated, because I've done that plenty of times. And all I do in here is I start out with just, I count the drops. That's about 10. And then I go back to stirring.
What paint did you use on that cowl?
On that,
The cowl.
on that cowling there,
Yeah.
I used polished aluminum Humbrol paint.
Okay.
And
That
I
actually looks really nice.
applied it with a brush. I took the streaks out using the sponge technique. I let it dry for a couple of days, and then I went after it again with a very fine, this is probably 600 or 700 grit wet. And I polished it. The reason being is that George Guinemer's airplane, he insisted on having his cowling polished. He did that because his favorite attack was the head-on attack. And he always came out of the sun. So if he can have the glare coming off his cowling into the eyes of the German airplane coming at him, then it helped him knock out his target.
Right.
So his ground crew polished his cowling rings. They did the same thing on his Spad 13, but in that case what they did was they waxed the metal on the front because it was painted yellow, because he insisted on that natural linen color that his Spad 7 was painted. It was kind of like a brownish yellow, very light color. And so the cowling was painted, since it was metal, and then they used a wax on it to keep it polished. Okay, now here, as you can see, there's that consistency. See that? How nice and thin that is? It only took 5 to 10 drops of thinner. Okay, so here, what I'll do here is just do a quick application in one area. So that I don't get too much time. And I'll just put it nice. See, I'm feathering it around, spreading that paint as much as I can. With metal paints, they'll move really great. You want to thin out that paint as much as you can. Now sometimes there'll be particles in the air and you'll get them in the paint. Don't worry about them. The beauty about using this technique is you can go back after it's thoroughly dry and just rub your hands over them, and most of those particles will come back out. If they take the paint with them, you just go back and do your touch-up.
Absolutely beautiful.
Done. I mean, it's that area.
Very, very nice. For the rear fuselage area, which is the lighter, I'll use the tester's aluminum. An air dryer.
Hair dryer.
Hair dryer, no. You mean to speed up the drying process? No. I don't do that. Hair dryers, especially the hand ones, if you get too close with them, you can destroy the plastic. Sometimes with enamel paints, you'll set them on fire. Because enamel paint, you can probably, yeah, you can do that with acrylic paint. If you want to accelerate the paint drying process, I would recommend using a dryer in low setting on acrylic, not on enamel. Not on enamel. Besides, again, I am in no hurry. I try to plan out my projects so that I give myself plenty of time. Being retired helps a lot. But I'm never in any hurry to let the paint dry. I find that the more patient you are with letting the paint dry, it's much better benefit. Much more beneficial.
So what I've used as a dryer is actually a food dehydrator. And placed the part in the dehydrator for overnight. It's a low heat, but it's hotter than my house, and it keeps air circulating. But being enclosed, it tends to reduce the amount of dust that will fly around too, and that works really well, especially if I'm not as patient as Rob, and I want to dry like a car body, so I can wet sand it and polish it in less than a week.
And the dehydrator, you can actually buy at like one of the thrift stores, Goodwill or something like that. You can buy them for $4 or $5.
Yeah.
And usually they're still good. You just have to use a lot of degreaser on a lot of them, clean them out good.
Just set it and forget it.
Yeah.
Except your model smells like beef jerky.
And it's a tasty
Or
model.
dehydrated bananas, banana chips.
I would recommend that you guys, especially unless you have a room where you do all your model building and nobody goes in that room but you, and the air stays fairly free of particles. If you don't have that environment, like I don't, I used to have a place like that, but unfortunately the wife didn't like the idea that I disappeared for so long building my models. So I build my models in the family room while watching TV while she's there. And she still complains about the smell, but too bad. But I did buy an air cleaner device. I forget what they're called. They stand up about so tall, and they drag everything out of the air and clean. Man, those things are worth their weight in gold because we have cats. And man, cat dander is just unbelievable how it gets into everything.
Yeah.
And I got a very nice, respectful cat. He doesn't go anywhere near my modeling stuff. But unfortunately, his hair doesn't have the same respect. Anyway, the lighter aluminum is here, I applied it, and I deliberately allowed the particles to stay in there so that I can move them out and clean them. This is already dry. I can take, look at that. See, I can move the particles off that were on there out of the way. See? That's a nice thing about this sponge technique. It takes so much of the thickness of the paint away that, especially with these flat metal colors, it really gives you the most minimal amount of layer of paint. So it dries a lot faster, so you don't really have to worry about an air dryer. Now,
And yet you still have good coverage, right?
yeah. Now, one thing I want to do right now, while this paint is fairly dry, I'll take a piece of sandpaper here and I am going to start sanding some of the surface of the metal paint away, because these panels are removed and installed and they get damaged and distorted. And while I got the opportunity, I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Also, the fabric covering on the center section here needs to be highlighted a little bit so it stands out. So really, there's really nothing stopping you from experimenting and from doing other techniques and things like that.
Yeah.
See? Yeah, look at that.
Yeah. Yeah, different colors.
Yep. Metal is
So that cowling that was going around was actually very nice and shiny.
mm-hmm. And that would go right here like this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that just
Then
because you were
then you come like that
using,
out of the sun.
is that just because you were using the polished aluminum Humbrol?
Well, it's a
for that?
different color.
Different
Yeah,
color?
it's a
Yeah.
different color completely. This is steel.
Right.
This is polished aluminum.
Right.
And this back here is
Yeah.
regular flat aluminum.
Right,
See?
okay.
But again, and since there's such a thin layer of paint, you can see how very nice and how easy it is to raise the surface. And also, since the paint gets damaged or blemished from the airplane flying and everything, you can weather your aircraft. Now, I normally don't do this until later, but I can do it right now since it dried. And that looks like a dope canvas-covered airplane. Okay? And here's another really cool thing you can do with aluminum. You find yourself a dry piece of foam. This is how I raise the surface detail on flight control surfaces. So you can see the ribbing that's underneath the canvas that sticks out. This is how I do it. Using a piece of foam, rubbing it down.
Yeah.
Pass it around. Okay, are there any questions? I don't know about you guys, but that was fun.
Fascinating.